Professor Zyvar hovered at the front of the vast lecture hall, his elongated, bioluminescent tendrils shifting in hues of deep blue and violet, a sign of anticipation. The amphitheater-style room, filled with some of the brightest young minds from across the galaxy, buzzed with an energy of mixed curiosity and apprehension. Students of all shapes and sizes occupied the curved rows of floating seats, their distinct physiology reflected in the tools they used, some scribbling equations with appendages that secreted bioluminescent ink, others projecting holographic formulas directly from their minds into the air before them. The walls pulsed softly, reacting to the shifting thought frequencies within the room. Zyvar's species, the Xelf, were known for their mathematical precision. His kind had spent millennia refining their understanding of the universe through numbers and logic, and today he was about to administer a test that no student had ever successfully completed. The problem he had prepared had been designed by the greatest Zelthian minds over 1,000 years ago, a mathematical puzzle so intricate and layered that even their most advanced quantum minds had failed to solve it within the given time. This was not merely an academic challenge. It was a test of intellectual endurance, of one's ability to navigate the vast, shifting complexities of theoretical mathematics. Zyvar exhaled, his multiple eyes scanning the students before him. A group of insectoid scholars from the Cerulean Belt sat together, their bodies twitching with nervous excitement as they whispered in clicking tones. A lone reptilian from the Agaran Empire flexed his scaled fingers, his amber eyes narrowing at the holoboard in anticipation. A translucent, amorphous being from the Uldran system shimmered in the front row, preparing its fluidic mind for the calculations ahead. But among them, seated at the very center of the room, was an anomaly, an earthborn human. Benjamin Rogers leaned back in his seat, one hand tapping a pen against the surface of his desk. Unlike the others, who were equipped with sophisticated computational devices, he had only a simple notebook, an old-fashioned paper-bound relic of his homeworld. While the others prepared by aligning their neural processors, Benjamin stretched his arms, cracked his knuckles, and glanced idly at the professor. Zyvar had observed him for weeks, perplexed by the way he operated. While the other students adhered strictly to logic, Benjamin often relied on an instinctual, almost chaotic approach to problem-solving. It was fascinating, albeit frustrating, to witness. Zyvar extended a limb, and a vast holographic equation illuminated the room. The symbols, shifting and expanding as if alive, stretched across the air in 3 dimensions, displaying interwoven layers of complex calculations. The students stiffened, their minds already attempting to deconstruct its labyrinthine nature. "This," Zyvar announced, his voice resonating through the hall, "is your assignment, a problem so advanced that no student has ever solved it within the given time frame. You have 1 week." The air in the room grew heavier as the weight of the challenge settled on the students. The Cerulean insectoids clicked their mandibles in quiet determination. The reptilian scholar let out a slow exhale through his nostrils. The Uldran's fluidic form rippled with a surge of mental energy. Benjamin, however, simply tilted his head and frowned. Zyvar noticed the expression. It was not one of concern or intimidation, but rather mild confusion, as if Benjamin had just seen a question on an elementary school test. Zyvar ignored the reaction and continued. "You may use any means at your disposal, computational interfaces, neural link calculations, or collaborative network processing. This is not a test of speed, but of intellectual resilience and problem-solving ability. Begin." The room erupted into a flurry of activity. Screens blinked to life, thought projectors hummed with raw cognitive power, and collaborative networks formed almost instantly as groups of students attempted to dissect the problem together. Equations filled the air, twisting and shifting as minds worked in unison. The ambient glow of the walls intensified, reacting to the mental effort radiating from the students. Zyvar moved to his observation platform, prepared to oversee the week-long challenge. However, before he could even settle into place, A voice cut through the commotion. "Done!" The room fell into absolute silence. Every eye turned toward the source of the voice. Benjamin sat with his notebook in front of him, his pen resting atop the page. His expression was neutral, almost bored. Xavier felt a sharp pulse of disbelief ripple through his tendrils. "What did you say?" Benjamin shrugged. "I said I'm done." "Solved it." The alien students exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from shock to irritation. The reptilian's claws flexed slightly, his muscles tensing. The Ceruleans clicked their mandibles in frustration. The Aldrin scholar pulsed in agitation. Xavier floated toward Benjamin, his eyes narrowing. "That is not possible." Benjamin tore the page from his notebook, folding it neatly before handing it to Xavier. "See for yourself." Xavier hesitated for a moment before extending a tendril to grasp the paper. The moment his eyes scanned the equations, his mind reeled. The answer was correct. Not just correct, elegantly so. What should have been a dense, multi-layered solution spanning hundreds of pages had been condensed into a single sheet of paper. Benjamin had not brute-forced his way through calculations like the others. He had seen a path that no one else had. The students leaned forward, waiting for Xavier's verdict. The professor remained silent for several long seconds, his tendrils pulsing with a mix of disbelief and reluctant admiration. Finally, he spoke, his voice measured. "How?" Benjamin scratched the back of his head. "I just looked at it differently. You guys tend to overcomplicate things. Sometimes, the simplest answer is the best one." Xavier's tendrils darkened, a deep shade of contemplation. He had spent centuries teaching the most gifted minds in the galaxy. Yet here was a human, a species, known more for their irrational behavior than for intellectual superiority, solving in mere minutes what no other species could grasp in weeks. The other students murmured, some in frustration, others in awe. The reptilian student clenched his jaw before exhaling in reluctant respect. The Aldrin scholar, despite its fluidic nature, seemed to stiffen in shock. Xavier set the paper down and turned to face the class. "This," he said slowly, "is why we must never underestimate the unpredictable nature of humanity." The atmosphere in the lecture hall shifted from stunned silence to a palpable tension. The other students, still immersed in their calculations, had halted their work entirely. Eyes of every shape and composition, bioluminescent spheres, segmented compounds, multifaceted lenses, fixated on the human sitting so casually at the center of the room. Some regarded him with disbelief, others with resentment. A few, however, displayed something more dangerous: curiosity. The reptilian student, a towering figure covered in hardened emerald scales, let out a slow, controlled breath through flared nostrils. His kind, the Agarans, were known for their discipline and rigid adherence to structured logic. He had spent hours analyzing the problem, breaking it apart, reconstructing it, applying every technique his species had developed over centuries. Yet a human had solved it before he had even begun. The Cerulean insectoids fidgeted in their seats, their exoskeletons clicking as they exchanged high-frequency signals only their kind could understand. Their hive-mind intelligence was their greatest strength, allowing them to process vast amounts of information simultaneously. And yet, for all their computational prowess, the problem still resisted them. The Aldrin scholar's translucent form pulsed in and out of focus, shifting through spectrums of color that indicated deep contemplation. His species existed in a near-liquid state, their minds capable of parallel thought streams. He had considered over 1,000 potential solutions already, yet not one had led to a definitive answer. And then there was the human. Benjamin had barely reacted to the sudden attention. He leaned back in his chair, spinning his pen idly between his fingers. If he noticed the quiet resentment building among his peers, he gave no sign of it. Professor Xavier's tendrils flexed as he set the sheet of paper down on his desk. His species rarely displayed emotion in the same way that many others did, but the slow, rhythmic pulsation of his deep blue skin betrayed the turmoil within his mind. He had seen mathematical prodigies before, but none like this. "Proceed," Zyvar finally commanded, his voice reverberating through the chamber. The students hesitated for only a moment before returning to their work. Hollow screens flickered back to life. Formulas stretched across the air, spinning and shifting in real time as alien minds struggled to find the solution that Benjamin had already discovered. The competitive spirit within them burned fiercely now. If a human could do it, they would prove they could as well. The reptilian's claws tapped against his desk as he entered a trance-like state, his golden eyes unblinking. The Ceruleans strengthened their neural connection, merging thoughts into one seamless processing unit. The Uldren's form darkened slightly as he split his consciousness into multiple branches, each analyzing a different possibility, but Benjamin remained still. Professor Zyvar moved toward the observation platform, his eyes narrowing as he studied the students' reactions. The balance of the room had shifted, and it was undeniable. Benjamin had disrupted the natural order of things. He had accomplished something that was not supposed to be possible. The reptilian student suddenly stopped typing, his slitted pupils constricting. "It doesn't make sense," he muttered, his voice low and guttural. His species rarely spoke during problem-solving, preferring silence and focus, but frustration had begun to seep into his usually stoic demeanor. Zyvar observed as the Igaran's massive hands clenched into fists before relaxing. He had reached the same impasse as every scholar before him. There was a moment where he glanced toward Benjamin, studying him as though he were something unnatural. The Ceruleans, still deep in their neural calculations, let out rapid, synchronized clicks, signaling a shift in their approach. If the previous methods were failing, they would try something more radical. They began deconstructing the problem at a molecular level, stripping away unnecessary variables, but even that seemed insufficient. The Uldren scholar, whose kind rarely displayed outward signs of struggle, began shifting more erratically. His once fluid form started to fragment at the edges, a clear indicator of frustration. Zyvar recognized what was happening. Pride. These students had trained their entire lives to be the best in their respective fields. They had never been outmatched before, certainly not by a species as seemingly primitive as humanity. The idea that someone had completed the task before them without even breaking a sweat was more than just a challenge. It was a direct attack on their perception of superiority. Benjamin finally let out a sigh. "You're overthinking it," he said, voice breaking through the quiet hum of the room. The reptilian's head snapped toward him. "Explain," he demanded, his voice tight with restraint. Benjamin shrugged. "You're looking at the problem the way you were taught to look at problems. That's your mistake." He gestured toward the swirling numbers hovering in the air. "You're layering the wrong logic onto it. Sometimes the answer isn't in the details." The Uldren pulsed sharply. "You imply we are blind?" His words were fluid, shifting tones like waves, but there was an edge to them. "Not blind," Benjamin corrected, "just stuck in the way you've always done things." Zyvar watched closely now. He had seen debates arise before, but this was different. The human was not just offering insight, he was challenging centuries of academic thought in a single sentence. The reptilian's eyes narrowed. "If you believe our methods are flawed, then explain your own." Benjamin hesitated, then, with a tired sigh, he pulled his notebook toward him again and flipped to a blank page. "All right," he said. "I'll walk you through it." The room had already been quiet, but now it became utterly still. Every student, regardless of species, turned toward him. For the first time, it was not Zyvar they were looking to for guidance. It was the human. Benjamin sketched out a few symbols, simplifying the structure of the original equation in a way that made it almost unrecognizable. He worked quickly, not because he was rushing, but because he saw the path so clearly. Every stroke of his pen carried certainty. The Ceruleans clicked in alarm. The reptilian tensed. The Uldren's body flickered. Zyvar studied the process, his mind racing to catch up. It was shockingly simple, The problem had been constructed with the assumption that it required a multi-tiered solution, each layer unfolding into greater complexity. But Benjamin had seen something none of them had. The equation wasn't designed to be solved that way at all. It was an illusion of complexity, a misdirection. He had found a shortcut that should not have existed. The reptilian's hands tightened into fists, then relaxed again. He was not angry anymore. He was unsettled. The Ceruleans withdrew from their collective calculations, the failure weighing on them. The Aldrin scholar dimmed, no longer shifting through spectrums. Professor Exivar's tendrils stilled. Human perception, he murmured to himself. The word sent another ripple through the class. For the first time in the history of the Academy, a single human had just changed the way they thought about knowledge itself. The silence in the room deepened, thick with tension and something else, something unspoken. The students, once driven by confidence in their superior intellects, now sat in a state of quiet disbelief. The reptilian student's sharp claws lightly tapped against the desk, his golden eyes flicking between the simplified equation in Benjamin's notebook and the impossibly complex projections still hanging in the air. The Ceruleans had withdrawn into themselves, their clicking whispers now subdued, as if the unity of their hive-mind intelligence had momentarily fractured. The Aldrin, usually so fluid in movement, remained motionless, his translucent form dimmed in contemplation. Benjamin exhaled slowly and pushed his notebook forward. His posture remained relaxed, but there was an edge of irritation behind his otherwise calm demeanor. He wasn't trying to embarrass them. He had simply seen what they hadn't, and their resistance to accepting it was starting to wear on him. He drummed his fingers against the desk and glanced at the professor. Zyvar hadn't moved. His deep-grooved form remained perfectly still, his tendrils frozen mid-motion, his many eyes locked on the human's work. The reptilian finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "You claim you saw this instantly?" Benjamin shrugged. "I didn't need to see it the way you did. I recognized the pattern." The Aldrin flickered slightly, a reaction that suggested skepticism. "Pattern recognition is a function of logic. You imply that your method is not bound by logic?" Benjamin ran a hand through his hair and leaned forward. "No. I'm saying your version of logic relies too much on rigid structures. You expect a system to behave a certain way, so you shape your thinking around those expectations. I don't. I look at the problem and let it tell me what it is, instead of assuming I already know." Professor Zyvar's tendrils slowly curled inward in contemplation, a reversal of cognitive approach. His voice was almost a whisper, yet every student heard him. The reptilian's jaw tensed. "That is dangerous." Benjamin smirked. "Only if you're afraid of being wrong." The reptilian's claws scraped slightly against the desk, but he said nothing more. The Ceruleans shifted uneasily, their mandibles clicking in an erratic rhythm. The Aldrin remained silent. The weight of Benjamin's words lingered over them all. Zyvar finally moved, his bioluminescent skin shifting in a slow wave of thought. His eyes swept the room, taking in the expressions of each student, noting the subtle changes in their body language. "This exercise was never meant to be about mere calculation," he said, his voice carrying the authority of centuries of teaching. "It was meant to test the boundaries of how one perceives a problem. What we have witnessed today is not simply an anomaly in mathematical reasoning. It is a demonstration of cognitive divergence." He turned his gaze toward Benjamin. "Humans approach problems in ways that are not predictable. That much is evident." The Aldrin finally stirred, his form pulsing as he spoke. "And how do we know this is not mere coincidence? A human getting lucky?" Benjamin chuckled under his breath. "Luck? You really think that's all it is?" Zyvar did not react immediately. Instead, he raised a single appendage, and the projection in the air shifted. The complex problem dissolved, replaced by something new? Something far larger, stretching across the entire ceiling in an intricate web of interconnecting equations. This, Zyvar declared, is the foundation of our species' most advanced theoretical model for hyperspatial resonance. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the room. The reptilians stiffened, the ceruleans froze, the Uldren dimmed further. Benjamin frowned. So what? Zyvar's tendrils curled. Solve it. A murmur of disbelief spread among the students. The reptilian's claws dug slightly into his desk. That equation took 3 generations to construct, he muttered. Zyvar's many eyes remained locked on Benjamin. If you are so confident in your perception, demonstrate it now. The challenge had been laid. The room had never been more still. Benjamin studied the projection for a long moment, his expression unreadable. His eyes traced the complex, almost fractal-like structure of the problem. It was undeniably alien in its logic, vast, layered, twisting into itself in ways that suggested non-linear thought. But he had seen something similar before, not in numbers but in nature. His mind flashed back to Earth, the spirals of a seashell, the branching veins of a leaf, the way water curved over rock, finding the most efficient path with effortless ease. He grabbed his notebook again. The students watched, barely daring to breathe. Zyvar observed, silent and expectant. Benjamin's pen moved across the page, not in frantic scribbles, but in measured, deliberate strokes. He wasn't computing the equation, he was translating it, breaking apart its rigid framework, peeling back its unnecessary layers. His pen never hesitated. He worked without doubt, without pause. Minutes passed. The tension in the room grew unbearable. Then, with a final stroke of his pen, he lifted the notebook and turned it toward Zyvar. The professor's tendrils trembled as he took the paper. Silence. Then, a shift in the air. Something intangible, something raw. Zyvar's many eyes scanned the page, his skin flickering through colors unknown to human perception. The other students leaned forward, their breath caught in their throats. Finally, Zyvar spoke. His voice was quieter now, but the weight behind it was undeniable. Correct. The room erupted, not in cheers, not in celebration, but in chaos. The reptilian stood so quickly, his seat nearly detached from the floor. Impossible. The ceruleans buzzed in a cacophony of rapid communication, their nervous system overwhelmed by the revelation. The Uldren dimmed to near transparency, his mind struggling to process the implications. Zyvar remained still, his tendrils quivering slightly. You understand what this means, the Uldren finally whispered. Zyvar nodded slowly. It means our entire framework of knowledge is incomplete. The reptilian let out a sharp exhale, his muscles rippling beneath his scales. A human has just... He stopped himself, as if saying the words out loud would solidify the absurdity of it. Zyvar's skin pulsed a deep, contemplative violet. This class was designed to push the limits of intellectual endurance, to test the boundaries of perception. I believed I understood those boundaries. I see now that I was mistaken. His eyes met Benjamin's. There was no longer dismissal in them, no skepticism. Only something far more profound. Recognition. Class dismissed, Zyvar said quietly. The students did not move, not immediately. The world they had known, the certainty they had clung to, had shifted in the course of a single lesson. Benjamin closed his notebook and stood, stretching slightly before shoving his hands into his pockets. He cast one last glance at the board, then turned and walked out the door. The silence followed him. Benjamin walked through the vast corridors of the academy, his hands still tucked in his pockets. The hallways, usually filled with the quiet hum of intellectual discourse and the rhythmic pulse of shifting light patterns along the walls, now felt different. A weight clung to the air, an almost tangible presence of uncertainty. He could feel the shift, not just among the students he had left behind, but within the very fabric of the institution itself. The academy had stood for centuries, built on the unwavering belief that knowledge was absolute, structured and decipherable through methodical reasoning. Today he had cracked that foundation. He hadn't meant to. He had only done what came naturally to him, what humans had done for as long as they had walked their own planet. Looked at a problem differently, refused to be bound by the rules that others blindly followed, and now everything had changed. A group of students passed him in the corridor, their hushed voices trailing behind them. One of the Ceruleans hesitated, his delicate antennae twitching as if sensing something he couldn't fully understand. The reptilian student from the lecture hall stood at the far end of the hallway, arms crossed, watching him with narrowed golden eyes. He said nothing, made no move to approach, but Benjamin could feel the weight of his gaze. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was something more complicated. Benjamin sighed and turned down a quieter passageway, hoping to clear his mind. He wasn't here to prove anything to anyone. He had come to this academy on an exchange program, hoping to learn, to see how the brightest minds of the galaxy approached knowledge. He hadn't expected to shake the very foundation of their thinking. He certainly hadn't expected to become the center of attention. "Benjamin Rogers," a voice called behind him. He turned. Professor Exavar stood at the entrance to one of the smaller lecture rooms, his tendrils curling and uncurling in slow, deliberate motions. His bioluminescent skin had shifted to a deep, contemplative blue, signaling a mind deep in thought. He gestured toward the room without another word. Benjamin considered walking away, pretending not to notice the summons, but he knew that wouldn't get him anywhere. He exhaled and stepped inside. The room was starkly different from the grand lecture hall. The walls were lined with intricate diagrams, pulsating with faint golden light, mathematical equations in motion, the lifeblood of Zyvar's species. It was a private study chamber, a place where only the highest-ranking scholars were allowed to contemplate the most advanced theories. Zyvar moved to the center of the room and turned to face him. "Do you understand what you have done?" His voice was quiet, but the weight behind it was undeniable. Benjamin frowned. "I solved a problem." Zyvar's tendrils pulsed a shade darker. "You did more than solve a problem. You exposed a flaw in our thinking, in the very way we approach knowledge. Do you not see how dangerous that is?" Benjamin tilted his head slightly. "Dangerous how? Because I didn't follow your rules? Because you revealed that the rules are not absolute," Zyvar corrected. His eyes locked onto Benjamin's with an intensity that most would have found unnerving. "For centuries, we have believed that intelligence follows a structured path, that understanding comes from meticulous calculations, from predictable methodologies. But you, your kind, do not function this way. You introduce chaos into a system that has never allowed it." Benjamin let out a small chuckle. "So what? You're afraid of a little chaos?" Zyvar's gaze did not waver. "Not chaos itself, but the implications of it. If what you have demonstrated today is not an isolated anomaly but a fundamental truth about human cognition, then everything we have built our knowledge upon must be reconsidered." Benjamin crossed his arms. "And that scares you." Zyvar was silent for a long moment. Then, with the slow precision of someone carefully choosing his words, he spoke. "It challenges me." Benjamin hadn't expected that answer. He had assumed resistance, denial, perhaps even a rebuke. But Zyvar was not like the other students. He was older, wiser. He had seen enough of the universe to know that change was inevitable. And yet, the tension in his form, the careful way he chose his words, betrayed a deeper conflict. Benjamin leaned against one of the empty desks. "So what happens now?" Zyvar studied him for a moment before speaking. "The council will hear of this." Benjamin raised an eyebrow. "The council?" "The governing body of the academy," Zyvar clarified. "They oversee the intellectual integrity of all research and learning. They will not ignore what happened today." Benjamin frowned. "You make it sound like I committed some kind of crime." Zyvar's tendrils curled inward. "No, but you have disrupted an order that has remained undisturbed for generations. That alone will warrant their attention." Benjamin exhaled. "Great, and let me guess. They don't take kindly to disruptions. Xavar hesitated. Some may see your insight as a valuable revelation. Others will see it as a threat. Benjamin ran a hand through his hair. So what? They're going to kick me out for thinking differently? Xavar shook his head. No, but they will question you, and you must be prepared for what that entails. Benjamin narrowed his eyes. And what exactly does that entail? Xavar turned slightly, his gaze drifting toward one of the floating diagrams that pulsed along the wall. The Council does not simply observe. It evaluates. It dissects. If they cannot categorize something, they seek to understand it by any means necessary. A cold feeling settled in Benjamin's stomach. And if they can't understand it, Xavar's silence was answer enough. Benjamin straightened, pushing away from the desk. You brought me here to warn me. Xavar turned back to face him. I brought you here because I do not believe ignorance will serve you well. You have introduced an unknown variable into a system that does not tolerate unknowns. You must decide how you wish to proceed. Benjamin looked at him for a long moment. There was something unspoken in the professor's words, a subtle acknowledgement that went beyond the lecture hall, beyond the equations. This wasn't just about numbers anymore. This was about something much bigger. Benjamin exhaled and nodded. All right, then I guess I'd better be ready. Xavar's tendrils pulsed in quiet acknowledgement. Yes, he said, you had better be. The council chamber loomed before Benjamin, an immense circular room constructed from smooth black stone that reflected the faint, shifting glow of the equations suspended in the air. The walls pulsed softly, filled with symbols so complex that even attempting to decipher them made his head ache. At the center of the chamber, elevated on a platform, sat the council. 12 beings of varying species, each representing a different intellectual order of the academy. Their forms were as diverse as their knowledge, some humanoid, others entirely alien in structure, with appendages that shimmered between physical and non-corporeal states. Their eyes, or in some cases whatever served as their sensory perception, were locked onto him with unwavering intensity. Professor Xavar stood to Benjamin's right, his posture rigid, his tendrils coiling and uncoiling in slow contemplation. He had brought Benjamin here, but beyond that he had given no indication of what to expect, no guidance, no reassurance, only the knowledge that what had occurred in the lecture hall had reached the highest levels of the academy, and it would not be ignored. A being at the center of the council, its form elongated and crystalline, spoke first. You are the human who disrupted the order of our most advanced calculations. The voice did not come from its mouth, if it even had one, but instead resonated through the very air, vibrating in a frequency that was felt more than heard. Benjamin crossed his arms. I solved a problem. That's not exactly a disruption. Another member of the council, a towering reptilian similar to the student he had faced earlier, leaned forward. You dismantled a foundational principle of our methodology. You did not solve it in the way it was designed to be solved. Benjamin arched an eyebrow. Since when does solving something the wrong way make it invalid? A murmur rippled through the chamber, subtle shifts in bioluminescent patterns flashing along the walls. The council members exchanged glances, some intrigued, others visibly unsettled. A different voice, this one smooth, precise, and eerily calm, cut through the room. We have studied your solution. It is correct, and yet it should not be. The Aldrin representative, its liquid form swirling in unreadable patterns, pulsed in agreement. The approach you used violates every structured theory we have established. If we accept your method, we must also accept that our existing framework is incomplete. Benjamin exhaled, already tired of the circular discussion. So what's the real problem here? That I found an answer you didn't expect, or that now you have to rethink everything you thought was true? Silence. Xavar did not move. But Benjamin could sense the professor watching him carefully. He wasn't here to defend Benjamin. This was a test, not a trial. He had brought him here to see what he would do, how he would handle this confrontation. The crystalline being spoke again, its voice sharp and unwavering. The Academy is built upon the principle that knowledge must be pursued through structure, through discipline. If we abandon that, we risk chaos. Benjamin shook his head. No, you risk stagnation. He took a step forward, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. You think that because you've built a system that's worked for centuries, it must be the only way forward. But that's the flaw in your thinking. Systems evolve. Understanding changes. That's not chaos. That's progress. The reptilian's golden eyes narrowed. And if we choose not to embrace this so-called progress, Benjamin met his gaze without hesitation, then you'll fall behind, and someone else, somewhere else, will figure it out before you do. Another ripple of unease moved through the council. For the first time, Benjamin saw uncertainty in their expressions, in the way their postures shifted, in the subtle changes in the ambient glow of the chamber. These were beings who had never been challenged in such a way, not by their own students, certainly not by an outsider. The crystalline being finally spoke again, but its tone was no longer confrontational. You believe humans possess a unique way of thinking, an unpredictable variable that cannot be replicated. Benjamin nodded. That's exactly what I'm saying. The Aldrin pulsed again, this time with something resembling curiosity. And if we were to study this unpredictability, to understand its mechanisms, Benjamin exhaled. You won't, not completely, because the moment you try to contain it, it stops being what it is. Another silence fell over the room. This one felt different. He had said something they had never considered, something they could not quantify, could not categorize. Xavar finally spoke, his voice calm, measured. The council must decide whether to reject or embrace what has been revealed here today. But one thing is certain. Knowledge has already changed, whether you choose to acknowledge it or not. The crystalline being regarded Benjamin for a long moment before inclining its head slightly. You will remain at the Academy. We will not interfere with your studies. But understand this, what you have done will not be forgotten. Benjamin nodded, accepting the terms for what they were. He hadn't come here to change their world, but he had. Whether they admitted it or not, their perspective had shifted. The cracks in their rigid structure had formed, and cracks always widened over time. As he turned to leave, Xavar walked beside him in silence. It wasn't until they had exited the chamber that the professor finally spoke. You handled that well. Benjamin smirked. You expected me to screw it up? Xavar's tendrils pulsed with faint amusement. I expected you to be less persuasive. Benjamin shrugged. Humans are unpredictable. You said it yourself. Xavar's bioluminescence flickered in thought. Yes, and that may be our greatest lesson yet. The Academy would not change overnight. The Council would continue their deliberations, and many would resist what had happened today. But the idea had been planted, the realization that intelligence was not a fixed equation, that sometimes the most profound solutions came from the unexpected. As Benjamin walked away, he knew one thing with certainty. He had not just solved an equation. He had changed the way the greatest minds in the galaxy thought about knowledge itself.